Hello, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to another episode of the Voice of Reason podcast. Today's guest is brought to you by the fine folks at ThinkSpot, who hooked me up with the illustrious Dr. Stephen Hicks. Dr. Stephen Hicks is a professor at Rockford University in Illinois. He's also a lecturer, a content creator, and an author who's been speaking about postmodernism for 20 years now. In this discussion, we use my documentary work on the Evergreen State College as a springboard to explore how postmodernism is supposed to be applied in the world and in interhuman interaction and within institutions of higher learning and so on and so forth. What else can I say except for that you guys are in for a real treat with this one. Here's Dr. Stephen Hicks. It's a total honor to get to speak with you. I've been aware of your work for a number of years now. One of the things that I most appreciate about your work is how accessible it is, and you actually make this intellectual milieu really actually fun to engage with by breaking it down into units that are easy to grasp, and then with that comes the ability to navigate through this landscape.
Great. Well, good. I appreciate the feedback. I spent some time looking at the documentary you've been working on, and that's also some very good work. Sad, frightening, at the same time, the application of theory. It's one thing to read these guys in the abstract and then project what it would be like in reality, and then you actually see the experiment being run.
Do you think that what happened at Evergreen is pretty much a direct application of postmodern theory?
Oh yes, absolutely. There's no unclarity about that. All of the elements are there. You're not interested in engaging with other people as rational beings, so you've given up entirely on the idea that there's argument and evidence and so forth. You don't see people as individuals. You see them as avatars or representatives of a group. You have a totally collectivized understanding of what it is to be a human being. You see those different collective groups as in adversarial relationships with each other. And the only way then those adversarial relationships can be resolved, if you're not going to do it rationally and civilly, treating individuals is going to be through group power struggles and a battle for dominance. And that's very clearly what one sees at Evergreen. The young student activists who've been paying very careful attention in their classes, learning from their professors. They're good students in that regard. And now they are, universities are a training ground for young scientists and artists and humanists of various sorts. And so here we see the training ground for activists of a certain sort, and they're flexing their muscles and seeing how much they can get away with.
Is there any other way that postmodern theory can be acted out in the real world? Did they misinterpret what they were handed?
Well, yeah, I think there are a number of substrands of postmodern theory. I mean, at a high level of abstraction, one is skeptical, one is relativized, one tends to collectivize human beings rather than seeing them as individuals. One has rather than a harmonious, rights-respecting expectation of civil society sorting its issues out peacefully, you have this idea that somehow things are a cynical, jaded battleground. Now, at a high level of abstraction, those don't necessarily predict a particular political outcome. So one can be cynical and jaded and skeptical about all sorts of things, and one's attitude can be to give up and to say, well, it's all pointless. There's no genuine value or truth to be sought in the world, and it's an ugly, ugly place. So I'm just going to withdraw and engage in quietism and defeatism. I think a lot of people who are schooled in postmodernism, they go in that direction. Another possibility, of course, is to say, if there are no truths, no values that are better than others, and no cultures or civilizations that are better than others, then the implication of that should be a kind of radical equalitarianism, where you then just say everybody's narratives are equally legitimate, all groups are equal. And so that can foster a kind of tolerationism, where we just have a live and let live, you do your thing, I'm going to do my thing as well. And that also can come out of strong postmodernism. But this one is another strain where you say, if there are no true values, we just have collectivized understandings of the way the world works. But at the same time, I feel some desire to assert my values in the world. I'm not going to be a quietist. I'm not going to just be a live and let live person. I want to see my agenda realized. Then one will become a kind of a power activist and so on. So I think there are multiple strands of postmodernism.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I was wondering your thoughts about, given your theoretical work on the procession of postmodernism through various different Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment discussions, when it gets to the era that we're in now, where we have a lot of people being trained in these various gender studies, racial studies, all these different studies groups that seem to be founded on conflict theory or on reversing a hierarchy or understanding everything as a relationship of power. So all these people are being trained in this thought process, and then they're going out into the workforce. And it seems like the only viable work that they can do is to insert themselves into HR departments or into activist enclaves within bigger corporate or educational structures. So I guess the question is postmodernism adaptive to bureaucracy? Is that one of its applications?
Well, yes. You're going to have lots of people who maybe in their heart of hearts, they want to be activists and out on the street and so forth, and wearing the black uniform, black on black. But at the same time, they are pragmatic enough to realize they want to make a living, right, of some sort. And so if they have a university degree, there's a natural pipeline for them to go into work, and then they will cast around, as you say, and see where their skill set best fits. And certainly HR departments is one department, because there you are in a position to choose who comes in and who doesn't, to shape the hiring and promotion policies. And that's a position of some power, but it doesn't necessarily require you to have management skills or marketing skills or leadership skills. Yeah, that's a possible route as well. Another way is if you are more of a subversive, you like the idea of being a revolutionary who doesn't fight street fights in a physicalistic form, but you like the idea of working within and subverting institutions that you think are corrupt. Then often from the SJW perspective, corporations are the big bad bête noire, kind of the great Satan of American life. So there's a charge to, in effect, being a double agent, right? So you go in and your goal is to subvert the institutions from the inside. So that's another possibility.
Is there any other way that this, once you adopt this ideology, what kind of value can you create in society? Or is it only, from your perspective, is it only about changing other people's values or controlling how other people behave? Can you create any positive value in the world?
Yeah. Well, at a high level of abstraction, I think postmodernism is ultimately negative. It's critique all the way down. It's a critique of knowledge, critique of any sort of metaphysics or scientific understanding of reality, a critique of the notion of that technology is improving the world, or that markets and democracy are viable positive projects. But I don't think any postmodernist is ever in his or her individual life going to be completely nihilistic. Typically people, particularly Americans, so the North Americans and so forth, They start off as typically, decent young people, and they imbibe normal North American values. And so by the time they go to university, they genuinely are, for the most part, decent people, and they're concerned about all of the things that decent people are concerned with, pollution and the legacy of racism and sexism and why we can't get along. But then, all of those issues can be dealt with healthily. But if you get a poisoned intellectual framework to understand those, then your positive values get turned against you. But they don't necessarily all go away. So you might start off as an ordinary, decent person who thinks racism is still a problem to some extent, but you don't have any conceptual tools other than the social justice warrior or the postmodern way of dealing with them. And so then you come to have a very jaded view of it. So what you will then have is, a person who is conflicted at some level. They really are anti-racist, but they end up using very jaded and proto-racist or reverse racist tactics in trying to solve the problem. So, so I think in some cases it's a fig leaf. I think in some cases, like some of the students we see in your documentary at Evergreen, they are just naked racists and power play people interested in dominating and trying to humiliate and control the institution. And I think for them, at their level of development, the anti-racism is a fig leaf. It's a cover. They can say, I'm against racism, and they know that that's going to mean people will give them the benefit of the doubt, cut them some slack, give them a moral sanction, because everybody is basically anti-racist at this point. But then you can use that benevolence and that tolerance against your target. And I think that's a calculated strategy. But I think if you were to talk with the average, say, freshman student at Evergreen or some such other place, that person probably is more mixed. They have some genuine anti-racism, anti-sexism. They're still decent human beings, but they are in the process of being transformed. Their intellectual understanding is in conflict with their, at that point, acquired legitimate anti-racism.
And how do you think, in studying this, you've been looking at this, or you've been speaking about this for 20 years now, I think, right? Was your first talk that I stumbled on was 1998. What are the steps that start to erode those, as you call them, the positive North American values into that jaded? What are some of the psychological phase states of that?
Oh, yes, right. Well, I think kind of first generation postmodernism, as I think of it, is, if you're thinking of individuals, such as Foucault and Derrida and Rorty and the others, they're all extraordinarily well-educated people, because at that point they are genuine intellectual minorities. They're well-schooled in the majority traditions, so they know the arguments inside and out. And they recognize the weaknesses in those traditions, and they're very good at teasing out the implications of those as well. So you start off with then people who know both sides of the debate very well, and they end up being on the other side of the debate. But then as those first generation postmoderns are training the next generation of students, particularly graduate students who are going to become professors, if your official conclusions are there is no truth, reason is not competent for coming to know reality, different groups have their own value struggles, and there's no logical or rhetorical way to bridge the gulf, then what that is going to mean in the second generation is those graduate students who are going to become professors are going to say things like, well, it's not really worth my time to try to understand the other side's arguments. I'm not going to be able to do that. And I'm not going to expect them to try to understand my arguments. So at that point, then you say, we're not going to do the argument thing anymore. We're also not going to say that we should treat each other civilly. That is to say that we should respect each other's differences of opinions, right, about debate, because civility means that we have a shared underlying concept of how we should conduct ourselves in society. But what I've learned from the first generation is that there is no such thing. There are no universal values. And so I've just got my values, you just have your values. So that then means discussion is going to break down. I think for a while, what's going to happen then is they will say, what we should then just do is kind of study or make equal time for all of the different perspectives in the curriculum. So, we'll have one group and we'll do our thing. Maybe we are feminists of a certain sort, or we're African American theorists of a certain sort, and each group will do its own thing, and they will just be arguing for a roughly equal place in the curriculum. Right? But each aspect of the people in the curriculum, they're just doing their own thing, and they're not trying to communicate with each other. Then I think a third thing, this is the third stage, and this is where we are now, is once each of those enclaves, right, within the academic world has its own power base, and it's then trained another generation of students, then it becomes a power struggle within the university. You want to have hegemony, you want to grow your department, your program, but typically that means squeezing out the other programs. And so you'll have kind of the nasty zero-sum power play politicking that's going on. So, so what you see at Evergreen in 2017 then really is that third generation. It's not in the first generation where I'm mythically reconstructing here. You would have had early Evergreen professors saying, there is a strong tradition or set of traditions that believe in truth and goodness and reality and liberty and equality, and they have these arguments against each other. And we think that's all ultimately crap, but we understand that tradition, and here are our arguments against that. And then you have a second generation of Evergreen professors who will say, let's stop talking to each other. Let's just make sure that all of these different groups have their own niches on campus and their own programs, right, and so forth. And then the third generation is going to be, some of those programs will start to assert themselves and try to squeeze out the others.
Well, what's the fourth generation? Is it the dissolution of the academy as the academy? Is it like it turns into a variety of different academies? Can these things get along at this stage going forward?
No, there's not going to be a getting along, right? So, smaller, more vulnerable institutions like Evergreen, there will be market feedback at some level, so it'll be harder for them to attract students, harder for them to attract donors, harder for them to attract first-rate faculty who want to come and teach there. And so, institutions that go too far down that road will just go into a self-destroying death spiral and will go out of existence, unless they have some huge endowment that they can coast on for a long time, and then the action will just gravitate to some other place. But no, I think the next step is going to be that other groups will then start to backlash and use the same tactics against the current generation of social justice warriors. So, if you then start to see certain sorts of feminism, for example, start to manifest themselves in very ugly, adversarial power play forms, then there's going to be a subsection of males who will then say, okay, well, we'll just do the exact same things back. And so it'll just be outright warfare. Or if, certain, members of racial groups, they want to up the things and turn it into racial war, then kind of the nice, tolerant members on the other side and the other racial groups will say enough is enough, and they'll just organize themselves racially, and we'll be back to old-fashioned race wars again. So you'll end up with a balkanization, if I can use that metaphor, right, or just tribalism as a little more generalized, and it'll just be just fought out. And at that point, you can't predict. If it's a race war, well, which race is going to win? If it's a sex and gender war, right, or if it's an ethnic war, well, I don't know. We've been having ethnic wars for generations, and we know how that history goes. It's not predictable.
Well, what do you think about an educational institution such as Yale, where they had a dust up and with Christakis in, I think it was 2015 or 2016.
Yeah, it was a couple of years earlier.
Yeah. And they seem to be big enough to, I guess, incorporate that way of thinking or ameliorate that crowd and still carry on. But it seems like the problem I have with social justice is that it likes to capture everything. It'll capture all the medical schools, it'll capture all the sciences, and insert its
Sure.
ideology, or cause the people who are trying to learn how to be a doctor to spend a lot of time on this other secondary material that they believe is primary. Is there any way to
Right.
stop it or slow
Yes.
it down or counter it?
Yeah, no, I think that's perceptive in two ways, the points you're making. One is, for all of kind of postmodernism's rhetoric about being anti-universalistic and anti-dominance and anti-imperialistic,
Colonial, yeah.
in practice, they are extraordinarily imperialistic and universalistic. Yeah, it's a total power agenda that they're going for. And you're right, Yale is different than a case like Evergreen. Yale has huge institutional resources and reserves, so it could, in principle, as Adam Smith said about economies, there's a great deal of ruination possible in a country. It does have deep reserves, so it can tolerate a certain number of self-destructive experiments and so on. And to some extent, we do expect universities to be hot houses and laboratories for all kinds of wacky experiments, right? And so a place like Yale, might even want to encourage. But then the question is going to be, what will Yale and the rest of us who are watching Yale going to learn, right, from the lesson? And I think one of the things that will happen at an institution like Yale is that this will be, I don't know, not a tempest in a teacup. I don't know how much to belittle it, but Yale has an extraordinary number of first-rate intellectuals who are doing really good work in all sorts of disciplines. And one of the reasons why the crazies and the activists and the people who are not really there for education, knowledge, truth, goodness, and so forth can get some traction at Yale is that the first-rate people are focusing on their work. They're trying to get stuff actually done. They're not taking the postmoderns and the social justice warriors that seriously. But then to the extent that the social warriors, I really don't like calling them social justice warriors because they're really antisocial
and
and they're anti-justice. They are warriors in a way.
Yeah,
so
they are warriors. We give them that.
Yes. We actually are the justice warriors. We have to recapture that label. Because we actually care about truth and facts and treating individual cases. But the point is, at a certain point, the first-rate people at Yale and the other institutions say, all right, this is enough of a problem. This is crap. This is interfering with my ability to do my work, my ability to train students and so forth. And so they will redirect some of their efforts. And as soon as you have the first-rate minds taking on what really are third-rate activist minds, it's kind of clear to me who will win at Yale. Yale wants to be a world-class institution. And I can't see the current generation of professors, the administration, even the students who are there who genuinely want to do something with their lives, the donors and so forth, putting up with it for too long. Now, maybe that's too optimistic, but that's my sense.
Do you think that the pursuit or the possession of excellence, whether of ability or of character, is one aspect that causes somebody to be immune to the siren call of what we're calling social justice?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the interesting questions in philosophy is whether one thinks about the issues rationally and considers arguments and evidence and counter arguments, and then makes up one's mind. And then depending on where one's reason leads, one's psychology, your emotions and your habits of thought and speech and action follow right from that. Or whether it's the other way around, that we start off with a psychology that is somewhat perhaps implicit, and then we're attracted to philosophical positions about values and knowledge and truth that support our psychology. So psychology is the driver, and philosophy ends up being kind of an autobiography of one's psychology. And that's an ongoing back and forth debate in the history of philosophy. Now, my view is that both paths are possible. I mean, I think in many cases it's clear that people come in with a psychology, and that lends them to pay attention only to things that push the buttons that they already like to have pushed, and things that take them outside of their comfort zone. They have blocks in places, and they keep their blocks up so they don't have to consider those things. So I think there are a lot of people who do come in who are already disturbed psychologically. Maybe they have a grievance against society, against reality. They already don't have much self-esteem, and they kind of have a sneaking suspicion that they're not going to make much of their own lives, but they still need to assert themselves in some way. So there's some dark psychological territory coming along. And that person, I think, is a prime candidate for certain kinds of ideology. Postmodernism is not the only one, but there is that road, and that's a natural recruiting ground. But I do think it can go the other way, that you can start with people who are basically decent, who are open to the evidence, open to argument, who have a more benevolent understanding of themselves and humans. But they take seriously the arguments, and they buy into skeptical, jaded, cynical understandings of the world. They really think that those are true. And over time, that shapes their thinking, that shapes their emotion, and then they can become poisoned individuals. So it can go both ways.
Were you at some point in your own development, and maybe college or undergrad, did you play around with that skeptical, jaded sense, or was it always distasteful for you? Or how did you decide on which path you wanted to go?
Right. No, I remember, I think in some ways I you're asking me to reconstruct the teenage Stephen Hicks. Where was I on all of these issues? I think I was mixed, but basically, intelligent, open-minded, positive values are possible person. At the same time, I wasn't, an idiot and a Pollyanist. I was, well aware of all of the hypocrisies and power plays, and I went through high school just like everybody else. So you get a good education in the social types that are possible. And even though I didn't typically read what my teachers assigned in high school, I was always reading history and literature and politics and so on. So I was aware of the dark side and the brutality and all of the possibilities for a cynical and jaded view of life. And I think that was where I was when I started university. And I got a very good liberal arts education at the University of Guelph, partly because they had genuine diversity of thought in a lot of the departments I studied in, political science, in history, and especially in philosophy. One anecdote I like to tell was that my philosophy department at the University of Guelph expanded dramatically in the 1960s and 70s during the baby boomer generation. And the chairman of the department at that time was a guy named John Bruce, who was a skeptic. And he basically was given a charge by the president of the university to go out and hire something like 12 or 14 philosophers to build up the department. But because he was a skeptic, his attitude was, I said, well, I don't really have an axe to grind here. And so he went to the Canadian Philosophical Association and the American Philosophical Association meetings with a shopping list. And he said, okay, I need a Nietzschean, I need a Popperian, I need a Marxist, I need a Kantian, I need a Thomist. And so he basically hired people from all over the intellectual spectrum. So this is coming back to answering your question. So that meant that by the time I got there, basically there were 20 philosophy professors, and they all disagreed with each other fundamentally because they were all coming from dramatically different parts of the spectrum. And I took courses with all of them. And what that then meant was, that those professors who were very strong skeptics, very strong relativists, very strong adversarialists, Marxists, and so on, and proto-postmodernists at this point, I engaged with them at a first-rate level, and it did have an effect on me. So I remember having weeks where I would be following a line of argument, and it seemed like it was leading to a very dark place. And if I was going to be intellectually honest, I had to go there. And in some cases, it was leading to very jaded places. And this means that I was going to have to look at perhaps my current friends quite differently, my parents and so forth. So there was an engagement there. And by the way, I remember deciding when I became a philosophy major was to say, look, facts are facts, and the only way to sort this out is going to be by following the best arguments and weighing them, and I will just go wherever those go. So that's the path I pursued.
Even if it landed you in hell, you're fine.
Yes.
With that.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So in that sense, there was a methodological primacy. We have to follow the facts. I have to be true to reality, however ugly reality turns out to be, if that turns out to be the true picture. That I have to deal with human beings as they are, even if my best understanding of human beings ends up being negative. So that willingness to go there was there. Now, I ended up not coming to think that those are the true or best understandings of reality, knowledge, and the human condition. But I think if you're going to really be a philosopher or any sort of intellectual genuinely, you do have to be open to that.
What landed you with a smile then, rather than a frown at the end?
Yeah. Well, I think it would just be a matter of reading the people who are advocates of science, realism in perception, that concept formation is a legitimate process, that logic actually works, putting those arguments up against the best skeptical arguments, and the positive accounts, right, prevailed. So, and it would be the same thing on issues of human nature, value, politics, and so on.
There's two directions I want to go, but I'm wondering if, armed with the tools of logic and science, that gives you some measure of power in the world, or some measure of legitimacy in actually being able to construct, rather than the opposite, which would be only being able to criticize indefinitely.
I would say as human beings, that is the most important power that we have, is the power of our minds to figure out the way the world works and to use that to guide our actions. We are, compared to other animal species, wimps physically. We have a big brain, and learning how to use that very well, that's where it's at for humans. So the postmoderns, if we take them as an instructive example at the other end, it does become bestiality. If you sabotage, which is what postmodernism, you sabotage your most powerful tool. It's ultimately, to give an analogy, to a young bird that learns to pluck out its own feathers. It's self-destruction.
You described a moment in your intellectual life that I think might map onto a moment in the intellectual life of our culture, where there was an ability for a variety of viewpoints to be held in tension. And it seems like over time, within certain pockets of academia, certain groups have won out. I wonder what allowed all those different viewpoints to be held in tension? What was the floor upon which all those different thinkers could meet or rest?
Yeah, well, I think the floor has kind of two, I don't know how far to extend this metaphor, two pillars or two sub-basements that support the floor. So, if the floor is, say, the ideal of a liberal arts college or a liberal arts university, where we're going to bring in genuine diversity of thought, and we're going to meet and consider each other's viewpoints and let the best arguments and interpretations prevail, and that we're going to be self-correcting, and any conclusions that we reach, we're going to be open to reevaluating. Now, if that's the floor, then the pillars are going to be, one, that there are such things as facts, that reality matters, and that we are striving to come to understand reality. And the other is that we are capable of doing so if we go through a certain process. And we can go through that process individually of being open to all of the data, and initially having an open mind orientation, to doing our best to try various ways of categorizing that data, to running experiments, to analyzing the results, to putting our interpretation of the results out there and letting other smart people critique them, and then taking seriously their critiques and responding to those. And then to formalize that in a social setting, which is what a university is supposed to be, where we're going to train young students how to do that, whether it's a literature class and we're interpreting Beowulf, or if it's a biology class or a politics class. So the platform then is, we're trying to get to reality. There is a reality out there. And if we follow this methodology individually and socially, we can do it. And what happened then is the skeptics in the subsectors of the academy that you're talking about, they won out. They became anti-realist. They came to believe that, well, hey, religious people and scientific people and everyone in the middle, we've been arguing for thousands of years and nobody can convince anybody else. So let's not talk about reality anymore. People are just going to believe what they're going to believe anyway. And then on top of that, they have a couple of centuries of very skeptical arguments that have been directed against all of the elements that I just went through, that we can be open to facts, that we can interpret things, that we can run experiments, and the experiments can give us decisive results one way or the other. All of that got hollowed out. So both the fact orientation and the pro-empiricism and reason orientation got hollowed out. And
is there a moment where they realize that they're undermining the ability of a utopia whatsoever? Because if they don't have a floor to replace the floor that they're eroding, I just don't see why you would do that if you don't have another floor. It seems like they have another better world constructed of equity or fairness, but it seems like it's missing that feedback loop.
Right. Well, that's an interesting question about postmoderns. And I think, again, there are subgroups within postmoderns. I mean, some will say, no, I'm taking the negative conclusion seriously. And what that means is that all values ultimately are failures. And I don't have anything to replace it with. Now, I might have my personal commitments that I've inherited or that I've lived with. But when I apply my own postmodern critical tools to my own values, I have to realize that my values don't escape that either. So all I'm left with is subjective preferences. And I can publicly assert those, but I can't publicly argue that they are in fact better than anyone else's. And so I think Derrida, for example, in the 60s and 70s was in this position. And I think Foucault, to a large extent, was in that position off and on. And I think someone like Rorty and Derrida later in his life, they are still kind of holding out hope for some way of having their value framework escape the corrosive effects of a thoroughgoing skepticism. So there's a late interview, for example, with Jacques Derrida before he died. I don't know the exact year, but he's being asked about what he actually believes positively. In effect, it's a variation on the question that you just asked. And basically what he says is very forthrightly, postmodernism and deconstruction, it leads to the creation of monsters. Right? It's just everything ends up being empty and ugliness. Everything is ultimately shit, and there is no positive value. But at the same time, and then he goes in a somewhat Platonic, Kantian way, but wistfully, where he wants to say that I would still like to believe in some sense that this equalitarian world vision can serve as a regulative standard, that in some sense it can escape the deconstruction. At the end of his life, Derrida was interviewed about exactly this issue and whether there was any positiveness that can come out. And he basically said no, but at the same time, he said wistfully that he kind of hoped that some sort of egalitarian idealism, because he was a quasi-Marxist all of his career, far left, right, and so forth, might serve in some kind of Platonic or Kantian regulative idea way and it's almost like as an otherworldly idea that I can't account for where it comes from, and I really hope that it's true, but I just don't have the intellectual resources to support a belief in something like that. So he ends up in a more conflicted place. Rorty, I think, is a milder case, very well read in the history of analytic philosophy and on the Continentals, and he ends up going very far down the postmodern road in terms of his understanding of the human condition and his anti-realism and his skepticism about the powers of empiricism and rationalism. But at the same time, he never, gave up his kind of far left social democrat convictions that in his heart of hearts, this is a true and positive vision. What he seems to settle on is that the way we formulate our values is not a rational process, but he still wants to hold that there is such a thing as a right set of values that can and should be urged. And so he wants to recast his rhetorical project. He's not going to use it in terms of truth argument and convince people rationally, but rather we are more emotionalist and socially conditioned beings, and that if he can just find a good way to use the rhetorical tools available to him, he can recondition a certain number of people to have the felt sympathy toward the values that he thinks are the right kind of values.
So he wants to return to pre-modern religious, some sort of reformulated religion then, with faith-based transcendent.
I wouldn't say that Rorty is at all religious or faith-based in a traditional sense. I would say he is emotion-based, right? So that it's not that we get these values from God or another dimension or a source. I think Derrida is to some extent holding out hope that maybe we're tapping into some sort of regulative idea source, right? Or there's that quip from Heidegger when he's being interviewed toward the end of his life, and he says basically everything has gone to crap, and all of his youthful ideals have been shown to have been betrayed, and so forth. And he says only a God can save us. And that is to say, it's not necessarily that he's believing in a God, but that he kind of is hoping that in some sense there's a godlike creature that can maybe come down and sort out the mess that we have made for ourselves. Now, I don't think Rorty is in that category at all. I think he's a secular thinker, but I think he thinks that we are primarily conditioned through kind of a linguistic methodology that works more on our emotions and our passions. And then what we call reasoning is an after-the-fact rationalization. So what we need to do is refashion our activism and our use of language in a more conditioning way of doing things, right, rather than a logical, scientific way of doing things. And then he's basically a nice guy, so he, in kind of the left liberal tolerationist camp, and so he is on the other side of those who come out of the Marxist revolutionary camp, where really we're fine with taking it to the street and punching people and killing the class enemies ultimately to refashion society. So he's more of a democratic socialist in that sense.
I still don't see how they aren't just trying to return to a religion or a religious way of looking at the world. I mean, is there like a third option that they're trying to fashion? One that's not reason, one that's not spiritual or God-based or faith-based. There's this soupy kind of Darwinian emotional neural network they're trying to form.
Yeah. Well, I take your point. When you look at social justice warriors, right, in practice, there are some very striking similarities to a religious mindset. So when we say it's a new religion, we're capturing something right important there. So, but I would say that postmodernism is a third option from a traditional kind of religion, because a traditional religion is going to say, metaphysically, no, there really is a reality. When we say that God exists, that's not just a social construct. That's not just a subjective feel-good assertion that I am making. Out there in reality, in another dimension, there is a being who is a God who created the world, right, and so forth. And so that is taken in a literalist sense. And then the more moderns or the more secular thinkers want to say, no, reality is the physical world. Maybe we can make an argument for a God or not, but probably not. And so we think reality is physicalistic, material, right, or whatever. But what the postmoderns are doing is taking seriously the anti-realism that they do when you push them, say it is meaningless to talk about the nature of reality, whether you say it's a religious reality or a physical reality. We just have to get rid of the reality talk. And so anytime that we use the word reality, we put it in the scare quotes. Or anytime we say there's a fact, right, we put it in a scare quote. So what we call reality is not out there objectively a God or out there objectively a physical world, but rather it is a subjective creation, right? It comes from within. We construct, right, our own psychological reality, and or if we are ourselves constructed as individuals to be avatars for various or vehicles through which social forces operate, then what we take to be reality is a social construction, and I am a vehicle for that social construction. So they are not realist in that sense at all. And also, I think on the epistemological side, one way of talking about religion is to say there are people who say things like, I know what I want to believe, and I'm going to close my mind to the arguments and the facts. And I know that there are good arguments against whatever my religious beliefs are, but I don't want to believe those things. And so as a matter of willing myself, I'm going to not consider those things and double down and redouble my commitment to believing certain things. So that's sort of a emotion subjective based believing. That's one prominent account of what faith is. And so we can say, well, if we look at the social justice warriors and we're trying to reason with them and say, maybe there's another way to reconstruct these facts, or you didn't attend to this, and you get the sense that they have their minds made up and they're not open to alternate interpretations. Or as we see in the videos that you've done, they say, we're not here to debate, right? We're not interested in that. And what's going on inside them is they have this very strong soup of emotions that are pointing them in a certain direction. And what animates them is unleashing those emotions and feeling committed to acting out on the basis of those emotions. And so the psychology is very much the same. But it's not religious, I think, in any traditional sense, because it's not that I'm making a faith commitment to some sort of being that I take to be an objective reality out there, however much subjectively and emotionalistically. It's a subjective emotionalist commitment to a purely secular social value agenda.
But there's positive feedback both within the religious believer when they face the discrepancy between reality and their belief, and the social justice believer when they face the reality between facts or the data and their theory. And that's being in a community of believers, a community of like-minded individuals. That's what props them up. That it seems like there was a hint of that in Rorty, where he just needs to create enough people around him, this liberal, secular blob together, that the reality itself comes. We can disregard reality because we have each other. Maybe that's what causes the it to
Oh yeah, yeah.
make
No,
sense?
that's very perceptive, and that's it. That's exactly right. So there's a concept that comes out of the objectivist literature of social metaphysics. That is to say that your metaphysics is constituted by your social circle, and you uh, either let others in your social circle construct what you take to be real, and suppress your independent judgment about what reality might be like in order to fit into the group. And you have exactly that sense that if enough people believe it, then we can make it real. Because most of them want to say, they recognize the psychotic break that goes on in some individuals. If I say, I know there's all those facts out there, but if I just really believe on something, then I can make it real. All that strong wishful thinking. So if you put it in individualistic terms, that seems totally nuts, and they recognize that. But if enough people believe it, then there's a mass psychology. And if I have trained myself out of exercising independent judgment, then I can genuinely come to believe whatever it is that my social group is. Now, there are deep epistemological roots in this, and this is why I think a lot of the philosophy of language that the postmoderns are very well versed in. So if you take seriously and fundamentally the idea that language is a social product, and I think fundamentally that's a false understanding of reality or of language. Language has lots of social elements, but it's not fundamentally a social product. It's an individual's mind in connection with reality. And other people might teach you words and give you theories and so forth, but ultimately what they're trying to do is guide your mind to grasp the facts as they are. But the philosophies of language that Rorty and Derrida, and to a lesser extent Foucault and Lyotard are dealing with, they do take deeply the notion that language is a social product, and that the individual is born into a social group, and you learn a language, and so that is your basic cognitive framework. It's a socially inculcated language, but that language comes freighted with a certain grammar and a certain semantics and a certain set of interpretive theories about the way the world works. And so you are conditioned to think a certain way. And then what the implication of that then is that people who are in different linguistic communities are then being conditioned into very different ways of understanding the world. And so then you're off to the races and running again. And there's no way for us to then bridge the linguistic gaps. And then if you combine that with a skepticism coming out of epistemology that says, all of the elements of language, all of the words that we use, all of those concepts, if you come to believe that there's no way to base them empirically in perceptual evidence or in any sort of sensory data, there's a gap between sensation and perception and conception and so forth, then reality drops out of the picture. So then you don't have individuals coming to grasp reality by their senses and then forming abstractions. What you have is members or unformed members of a group that are born into a linguistic community, and they are shaped and formed by that linguistic community. So, yeah, another
Take it back a
route.
little bit. You brought up the scare quotes that they put around truth and reality, and you say it's meaningless to talk about reality. And I'm wondering what is never scare quoted then? Once you go down that path, there's got to be something to stand on, something that you can't scare
Yeah,
quote that's true, even if it is that scare quote as an act of
right,
mastering something else or being a part of,
right.
like, I'm gain reality by distancing myself from something.
Yeah. And again, I think there are variations within postmodernism on how to address that question. So if we take postmodernism and we purify it and we push all of those themes to the end, then it does seem like you end up where you can't say anything without contradicting yourself, without engaging in a kind of performative contradiction. So, even if I put, things in scare quotes, right, then I'm presupposing that the scare quote means something. Right?
Yeah.
That symbol has a cognitive referent, and that you, even though you're a different individual, can understand what I mean by that. And so we have a shared reality that we are dealing with. So at a very minimum level, if I'm going to speak, even to the act of doing ironic statements and so on, I'm not able to state without contradiction that all language is subjective and opaque across linguistic communities, right, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So it's to generalize, it's the standard paradox of relativism, that I can't say that all truths are relative, or all claims to knowledge are relative, because then I'm including that as a knowledge claim, but I'm trying to exempt it from the relativization. So all knowledge claims are relative is an attempt at a universal claim, not to make a relative claim, right? Or everything is subjective. If I want to say that to you, well, I'm trying to communicate an objective truth to you, that it really is the case factually that truths are objective, in which case I can't say that all truths are subjective. Or there is no certainty. Right? Well, that is a very strong claim that I'm trying to make certain. And so the usual thing then just is to throw the claim back. Well, are you certain of that? And you have to say, well, it's probable that all claims are certain, or well, are you sure of that? And then you just end up babbling, right, ultimately. So, in philosophy, we call this the Cratylus option for the ancient Greek skeptic named Cratylus, who realized the end road that all of these skeptical arguments were reaching. You can't, in fact, say anything. And so, true to his beliefs, he just shut up and stopped saying anything.
I'm sure some people were happy that he went that route.
Yeah, we wish, right, in some cases, right, don't we? Yeah, please take the Cratylus option. Yeah, so if you were then going to go ahead.
No, what's the net? What's the safety net then to keep them from going that far? Because they don't want to shut up.
Yes. Well, then I don't know. Then I think we have to say that it comes down to a matter of personal psychology. If you want to keep talking, then it does seem like you're committed to thinking that there are some values that are to be gained from continuing talking. And it does seem like you're still saying, well, there are other people out there, and I believe that they are real beings. And I believe that language is a real phenomenon. And I believe that language communicates something. And so I'm going to continue to try to use language to communicate with other people. Now, of course, they might then back up and say, well, this is just a personal, happens to press my subjective value judgments. Some people might, go into a studio and put paint on a canvas. I'm just going into my office and putting words on a page. It just makes me feel good. And at least intellectually, that's the best I can say about my project.
James Lindsay postulates that with intersectionality, they made the one sacred ground, or the one real island to stand on, oppression. And that's the one thing that you can't question, or that's the fundamental value. And that's how they resurrected the project of postmodernism and kept it from.
Yeah. Well, there is that one. I think there's two. Again, we have a fork in the road, and the other one would be power. There are some postmoderns who will argue this is not necessarily a value judgment. They'll say if we understand the way the world works, then kind of the ultimate substratum of reality just is power manifesting itself in various forms. And this is then to take the Nietzschean route seriously. So there are no entities, there even ultimately aren't individuals, that we are all just vehicles through which power, the will to power, is flowing and manifesting. Now, if you go that route, then you're still doing a certain amount of metaphysics. And I think Foucault, right, on this score, sometimes he's saying that he really is just carrying on the Nietzschean tradition. And so he's not a full-out anti-realist, but rather we will just reduce all of what we think are other realities, material objects, gods, human beings, and so forth, to manifestations of power. Now then, to get to the others, right, those who want to say that we do have another bottom line, and the problem is that yes, everything is power, but power manifests itself unequally because some of these manifestations or some of these local vehicles have a lot more power than others, and then power being what power is, the stronger power centers oppress and exploit the weaker power centers. And that's our description of the way the world works. Now, if you're a full-on Nietzschean, then you will say, okay, so no problem. That's just the way the world works. And you might as well just embrace the way the world works. Right? Power is a hegemonic, dominating, right, process. And so in some sense, if you have sympathies, your sympathies are going to be with the more powerful manifestations, and might makes right, and it just ends up that way. So the analogy I sometimes use is, if we step outside of a human framework and we look at, say, a predatory species, we look at the Serengeti, and you've got lions and jackals and zebras and antelope and so forth, and they are engaged in a power struggle for survival. And each of those different animals is a different center of power, constituted differently, and they are in adversarial relations to each other. And one thing you can do is say, well, so the lionesses chased the antelope, and they caught the antelope, and now they are ripping the antelope apart. So how do you evaluate that? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And you say, well, there's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just the way the world works, right? It's just, today the lions were more powerful than the antelope. And you would say the same thing, the next day the lions are chasing the antelope, and the antelope is faster, and the antelope gets away. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You say, well, the same thing. It's just, in that case, speed, that power won, and the world just goes on. So we don't apply a normative value. And it's not that we're supposed to be in favor of one side, right, or the other. Just power just continues. Now, you can also, though, say, when I look at, animals like, I don't know, wildebeests and zebras, they're kind of fine and so forth, but I really prefer lions. There's something majestic about lions and the king of the jungle, and they're more powerful. So really, I'm going to pull for the lions. And so there's something more noble, right, about being a predator rather than there is about being a prey. And I think Nietzsche, if you push Nietzsche, then he's going to be more on that side of the equation. Now, to get to the James Lindsay equalitarian people, I think what you would then say is you have this understanding that the universe is ruled by power, and there are unequal centers of power, and it's all adversarial and struggle. And somehow you find that your sympathies are with those who are on the losing ends of the struggle. So when the lion catches the zebra, you feel for the zebra, and the lion is kind of the big bad predator. And so then when we make the transference to humans, we then say, okay, some humans are stronger than others, and humans are beating up on each other, and the whole history of the world is the history of exploitation and oppression. And we feel for those who have been on the losing end of the oppression. Now, where that comes from, that's another story. But then that will then be, if you take that as your universal value, that a good person feels for the exploited, feels for the oppressed, feels for the meek, then you do have a value framework. And that will then say you can enter the power struggle on behalf of those who have been on the losing end of things, and that's okay. You can use all of the power tools against the exploiter, against the oppressors, because you're on the side of the sheep or you're on the side of the zebras and so on. I think there's three versions of postmodernism. One is to say there are no values, everything just is power. right? Or everything is, there are no values and there is no reality, even power, right? We just have different narratives, and in some of them power is the narrative and some isn't. And then a third option is to say power is the substrate, but we're on the side of the victims of power.
Do you think that that same sort of logic or moral valuation is what prompts people to choose reason, because they see that reason is ultimately, or logic and reason and Enlightenment values, those are ultimately the most powerful tool that we have, and so I'm going to put my eggs in that basket rather than the postmodern basket, even if they're equally wrong?
No, right. That is the camp then that I would be in. So I would say,
Okay.
But I'm putting it in a realist framework. That is to say, when we study the human condition, we study the world. If humans are going to survive and flourish right in the world as it actually is, they have to use the tools that are available to them, and reason is one of those tools, and it is the most important tool that human beings have. And if we can then show that it is efficacious, then that is the one that we should commit to using. So that's the old Francis Bacon line about knowledge is power. And so the capacities that enable us to get knowledge, we don't pursue knowledge just as an end in its own sake or because it's kind of fun or whatever, even though it is fun. Ultimately, we want knowledge because knowledge translates into practice, and practice makes us better at living our lives.
Is there something else that a society needs other than just reason, then? Is there like subsidiary aspects to a culture that need to be in place in order for reason to maintain its efficacy? I'm getting back, it's a loaded question because I'm getting back wondering if the reason that postmodernism came back was because there was no religious structure undergirding or in conjunction with a reason structure. So it has to revert back into a number of people can't reason their way through things. They need to feel their way through things. And without that religious substrate, there's no place for those people to find a home and connect with the reasonable people.
Well, maybe I'll ask you to say a little bit more about what you mean by a religious substrate. Do you mean a shared set of beliefs or a shared set of habits or a shared moral framework? Is that what you mean by a religious one?
Yeah, fundamentally, it would be a narrative structure that ties a group of people together, like just a story of who we are. And that story would have pictures and songs and all the things that plug into that story that fill it out and give room for all these different characters to exist together in a cohesive whole. I just don't know if reason alone can sustain a society in all its different aspects.
Okay, so if I'm understanding your second elaboration on that point, the key concepts in there were stories and narratives. And there, the contrast is to say that reason is very abstract, and stories and narratives are concretizations. So we don't talk about human nature, we talk about Shakespeare, and we talk about Chaucer, and we talk about Canterbury Tales, and so forth. And in that, we're bringing reason down to earth in a way that's understandable to more people. Is that where we're going? So it's not just an abstracted theoretical understanding of the world, right, and so on. Oh, no, I think that's right. Yeah, I would say as human beings, at least my understanding of reason, what I mean by reason is not something that is only a set of highly abstract propositions at a very theoretical level. My view of reason is that reason operates at all levels of abstraction, including its connections to one's perceptual understanding of the world. So I have an empirical understanding of reason, not a purely abstracted or what's sometimes called a more rationalistic or a purified reason understanding of the world. So yes, and I do think that stories and narratives are absolutely crucial for even the most intelligent, abstractly powerful individuals, because we all, and this is part of the knowledge is power thesis, I think, that comes out of Bacon, We all do need to understand the world in principle, in terms of generalities, in terms of abstract causal systems that are operating out there. But we also need to be able to translate that to the practical day-to-day events in our lives. And that's a huge project. So, if we take one virtue, for example, I mean, we can say courage is important, and you and I can abstractly define courage and distinguish it from brashness and timidity and so on. And we can have, beautifully worked out abstract taxonomies of the virtue and the corresponding vices. But in order to really understand courage, we do need to see examples of it. Those need to be concretized. So it's got to be, do you remember, Benjamin or Stephen, when you were in second grade and that kid came up to you and tried to steal your lunch money? Right, that particular example. And or to have the bedtime stories where your mom or your dad is reading you a story about made up characters who were doing courageous things and contrasting. So those are the concrete examples. Then we have the artistic narrative representations, but we also need to go up and be able to define and conceptualize it and put it in the context of an overall moral theory. So yeah, my understanding of reason that is robust and it operates all up and down those levels of abstraction. So to come back then to your question, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it started to sound like maybe there was a kind of an intellectual history question there, that maybe space for postmodernism and its skepticism came out of the modern project of reason being too abstracted or too purified, and that it gutted or dispensed with some shared cultural understandings that had been built up in the West over the course of centuries, some of them religious, some of them not necessarily religious. And so we tried to get too scientific and too rational. I'm just reconstructing a possible question. Too scientific and too rational too quickly, and we threw out all of the traditions, and that left a vacuum where people felt empty and not knowing what to do, and postmodernism rushed in to fill that vacuum. Something like that?
Yeah, is that plausible? Do you think do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that?
Well, I think that's the story that conservatives will tell, and that some of the postmoderns also will tell. So if you think about Nietzsche and his famous phrase that God is dead, he does think that it's in one sense, a good thing that God is dead, but he's also recognizing that the death of God has happened too fast for most human beings. And even sophisticated intellectual human beings who become existentialists, that for them, the death of God and all of the comforting stories and narratives and values that are part of that package, if you are raised with them and then suddenly you read a few books and you're 20 years old and it's all wrenched out and your reason is telling you that God is dead and you don't have anything to replace that with, well, then you're in a pretty dark place, right, psychologically. So I do think the truth is that we do need to have values in place as we are living our lives, and it's important that they are healthy values. So if you too quickly destroy all of your value framework and don't have anything to replace it with, then you will be psychologically in a dark place. And culturally, more broadly, if you have a large number of people who are doing the same sort of thing, then you will destroy the institutions. But my view is it's not a conservative one. I think that as the modern world developed, a lot of non-religious and more modern-friendly value stories were being developed. So there were lots of positive options available to them. And people, when they surveyed their actual lives, they could see the concrete improvements that were going on. So I don't think, as a matter of intellectual history, that's a very good account.
Okay. I was asked about, because I was making a statement. I don't know if we can counter postmodernism, as I think of it as being rather destructive of our society without a better story. I think that ultimately they're telling a story. Everybody's got these different stories. So what's the best story? And I understand that reason is what's going to evaluate whether or not any given story is good. But somebody asked me, when will we ever let go of our training wheels as a society? When will humankind let go of our training wheels? Meaning, religion, broadly construed. But it feels like we're in a eternal September where there's always just younger people, or we're always being refreshed with people who don't understand life or who are fools that need that wisdom passed on. And I just see that narrative as the structure of passing on knowledge over and over again through time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one of the narratives is historical, and so where I think history education is important. So we do have a very powerful narrative that starts in the Renaissance about taking the individual seriously, and that we want to live full lives, and that we shouldn't be captives of class, gender, and various other restrictions that have been placed on us. That human beings are wonderful, and with good education, they can really pursue high dreams and make something of themselves. And that is a powerful narrative that we tell, and we tell it a lot, and it has succeeded very well over the course of the last 4 centuries. We also have the science and technology narrative, and I think that also has been very successful. At some level, people recognize that all of the superstitions and all of the crazy theories, and religion does get a lot of blame here for holding us back on and retarding the progress of science. It's not to say that all religion has to be so antagonistic to science, but there's a lot of blame to go around there. But we do have a positive science and technology story, and we recognize that story. So, the Enlightenment has been an awesome achievement. The Renaissance has been an awesome achievement. We're continuing to make progress. So I think the fact that we have a great Hollywood movie industry that's now expanding and it's becoming multi-centered. But as much as we like to be cynical and jaded and beat up on Hollywood movies, the fact is that we get wonderful narratives from them that we resonate to them. We believe in the love story. We do, right? Except for a few people, who've gone through too many divorces or bad breakups, right, and so forth. But that's a narrative. It is possible for decent people to find real love and a happy ever after. It's not easy, but it is possible, and we believe in that. And we love the action stories, and the competent, resourceful, smart, James Bond, Jason Bourne. You run through it. We love that story, and it's good versus evil, and the good guy wins. We believe in the triumph of good. So we do have all of these narratives: the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Hollywood movies. I think we still are largely in an Enlightenment culture. And, as you said, it is cyclical. We do have people who long for the good old pre-modern days and the intellectual framework that supports that. We do have people who are cynical and jaded and just want to burn the place down. And we have those people in every generation, but we do also have the people who want to make a meaningful life, and we're enabling them to do so. In a broad philosophical sense, for those of you who have studied the Greeks, it is Plato, right, versus Aristotle versus the Sophists, right, all over again. And every generation has all three contingents: kind of the otherworldly, the this worldly, and then the skeptical relativists. And I think right now, of course, we're in a somewhat cynical, skeptical, relativistic place in intellectual and high culture circles. But we do still have a lot of great resources in the broader Enlightenment culture.